Hello and welcome to the AES Build for 2024. So here's your circuit board. So if you're working in the lab, you have these circuit board holders that really help with the build process. First thing we're going to do is clamp this in. So I want to put it in ideally so that I'm not blocking any of the components I need to work on. So if I put it all the way up here, that'll work. And then loosen this bolt down here, slide it on, and what I like to do is push it on until this spring is about halfway compressed, and then tighten that up. And then that gives me the ability to flip it around as I need to work on both sides. These two smaller circuit boards are going to be broken off at some point, but there's no reason to do that yet. Right now it helps hold this larger one in place by keeping this one here. If this one gets in your way, you could break it off, but it shouldn't be a problem. If you need to, if you want to put it more in the middle and then just move it when you need to get to these components, that's fine. You can tighten up these top parts. I tend to leave it like this. It lets me move it as much as I want. I've got a little bit tightened just so it doesn't bounce around too much. So I'm going to start with the resistors right off of my step one list. The first ones are R1, 2, 3, and 4, which are all 10 ohm resistors. So in my bag of 10 ohm resistors, got my first one. Find R1 over here. Put it in, and I'm going to put all four of these in at the same time and then solder them. So there's R1. R2 is right here. R3 is here. And then R4 right here. Now for resistors on double-sided boards like this, I prefer to solder from the top. So I'm going to zoom in so you can get a better view of my soldering. I always start off by cleaning the tip and just one wipe, flip it over, one wipe. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it. The more you touch it to either the sponge or the metal wool that you'll be cleaning it with, the more it's going to cool off. So you don't want to spend too much time on it. Just one wipe on each side. I'll start over here with R1. So the process is put the iron on the board and the component lead. Give it a second. Touch it with solder. Leave the iron on for a second. Take it off. Same thing on the other side. Iron on. Then tap the solder. Then iron off. The solders look good. The other side, we'll also see they've gone through. They've gone through and look nice and clean, shiny, nice and solid. I could add more solder if I wanted to. That's not too much solder, certainly. To me, that's just the right amount. I'll do the one next to it. Again, iron always goes on first, then the solder. I'll do a little bit more solder this time, just to show you how it can look a little different. Something on here. But the really important part is iron on, wait a bit, solder on, wait a bit, then take the iron off. So you look and you can see it's a bit more solder on that second one I did than on the first one, but not a huge amount. And then the opposite side of the board, that's what they look like. And what's really important is that you see that the lead and the solder and the board all look like one thing. If there are lines between any of them, then you've got a bad solder. Make sure my couple of other resistors that I hadn't soldered yet didn't fall through much, because I want them completely against the board if at all possible. That'll help with the physics of everything. If they're sticking up on their leads away from the board, then all the force of that component bouncing around when you move this goes onto the solders. If they're physically touching the board, the body of the component, then that strain doesn't transfer to the solders. And you'll have longer lasting solders. Again, iron goes on, then solder, iron stays on, and then it comes off. Give you a little different view. I don't know if this will help. See if I can focus a little bit better. Now this is completely facing away from me, so we'll see if I can do this. Just to give you a different view of it. I'm trying to do this entirely on the camera, so it's pretty difficult. So we go. Our first 4 resistors soldered in place. The solder should flow to the other side of the board. That's what we want. So we have nice looking solder connections on both sides just by soldering from the top. The nice thing about soldering from the top is that I put the resistor in, it sits there, and then I solder it. If you try and solder the other side, you have to somehow hold that resistor in. Some people will bend the leads. I find with students that typically gives you much higher likelihood of bad solders, so try not to do that if possible. So just solder them from the top. It's the easiest and also gives you the best result. So now I'm just going to keep going through and finish all of the resistors. Now we're going to move on to the integrated circuits. There are 5 of them on the board. 2 of them are these larger 14 pin, and then there are 3 of these 8 pin. We're going to use sockets, so we can take the integrated circuits in and out easier and help with some troubleshooting. The ones we have these little bent pins, which are nice, because that means that you can put them in the circuit board and they won't fall out while you're soldering them. One end of the IC socket has a little notch in it, and the symbol on the circuit board also has a little spot that shows you where the notch should be. That ensures that the IC will go in correctly at the end. So just push them into the holes and give it a little bit of force, and they lock in place. This other big one, again, there's the little notch. There's the symbol on the board. You do want to make sure that they're down and flat in case they've moved at all. And they're soldering them the same way we have been. It's more solders, but they go pretty quick. Always same process, iron on first, way to beat, then solder. If it looks like my solders are going a lot quicker than yours are, I've been doing this pretty much every day for a couple decades, so I've had lots of practice. Take your time and get the solders really clean and pretty. They'll make a huge difference. And then go through the same process for all the other IC sockets. Now we want to move on to the diodes. So there are 2 diodes on top of the board up here, D3 and D4. The other 2 are on the bottom of the board, D1 and D2. I'll do the ones on top first. Whichever order you want to do is fine. So the diodes on the circuit board, there's a line on one side of the symbol. On the diode itself also, there's a silver line on one end. So line those up. With the resistors, it does not matter which direction you put them in. With the diodes and some of the capacitors, it does. Again, I'm soldering these from the component side, same process. Iron goes on, then the solder, then iron comes off. Then I'll flip it over. Get the 2 on the bottom. Again, lining up the line on the component with the line on the board. And again, soldering from the component side so they don't fall out. So now we're on to our capacitors. So start off with our 4.1 microfarad capacitors. Look like this. Now these, if you put them in so they're just a little bit off the board, like that. So don't push them down all the way. You can, but if you leave them up a little bit, then you can solder from this side. If you put them all down all the way and turn the board over, they start to fall out. That's okay, however you want to do it. They can stick up a little bit like that though. I find that easiest. And then I'll solder this now. So unlike the resistors, for this capacitor at least, I'm going to solder it each one as I put them in so they don't fall out. And I like to do most of the capacitors that way. There's C1, C2, so the other option is to put them in, and this one I'll even push down all the way so you can see, and then turn the board sideways, and then solder it. You just want to make sure they don't push out too much. So I soldered one side. Make sure the cap is where I want it. Go back and solder the other side. So now it's not going to fall out, so I can actually turn it this way. So whichever you find easier, either of those options will work. I'll do 3 and 4. So I'll show you another one. In this case, I have enough access to it that I let them drop down all the way, but I can go ahead and solder one of the two leads. Solder one lead just to hold it in place. Then I flip over and solder the other lead. I'll go ahead and cut those leads now. Now we'll go on to the 0.022 microfarad capacitors, which look like this, are the smaller of the two red ones. So C5 is here. Again, I'll put it in, tip it up about halfway, and then solder it. I don't like bending the leads like some people will show you to. So I'm going to, no, I just lost it. Drop that one. I find that when you bend the leads, it tends to be harder to get a good solder, or at least easier to get a bad solder. So what I'm going to do now is hold my finger against it, flip it over, and then hold it in place while I solder it. Solder the first of the two leads. Check that it's where you want it to be. So I want that one down a little bit longer, a little bit farther. There we go, closer to the board, right against the board. So I just heated up the solder, pushed it down to where I wanted it, and then I'll do the other side. C5 and then C6, just over here. Same thing, hold it, and solder it while holding it against the board. Yeah, but you can talk.
What do you want for dinner?
Oh, I don't know.
Nobody knows.
My head aches. When you get to the electrolytic capacitors, or any of them that are in these tape pieces, I usually just pull them off. Pull them out like that. And this is C8. Here, the long lead is the positive. The shorter lead also usually has the stripe on it. And then on the board itself, there's a mark for the plus. The plus is also the square lead. Or excuse me, the square pad. So the longer lead goes into the square pad. Push it all the way down. You want this to be completely against the board. That's really important on these. Same thing, I'm going to hold it with my finger. Solder at least one of the two leads. Cut that off. Again, put the cutters against. Let it fall down to the board. That's where you want to cut. And then we've got some more on the tape. These are the 47 picofarad. In this case, since you don't care about a longer or shorter lead because they're both the same size, you can just cut them off the tape if you want. That's another way to do it. If you find that easier, go ahead and do that. Now onto the transistors. So you have two different transistors. You have the 2N5457, and the numbers are right on the front, and the 3391s. So those are your two types of transistors. So we'll start with Q1, which is a 2N5457. And that goes right here. So the back leg, the middle leg has to be bent back a little bit. What I usually do is just, let me zoom in so you can see this. So I'll just put one leg in and the second leg, just bend back and then squeeze it forward to the front one. And then you want it to be pushed down, but not all the way against the board. So about like that. And then the other one goes into Q14. And then the 3391s are Q2, 3, and 4, all right up here, all right here. So we're getting close to finishing up now. So I'm going to put on the jacks. So the 1/4 inch jack goes right here. So none of those you need to hold in place while you do the first solder. Do one of the middle ones. And then just check it. Make sure it's completely against the board, right where you want it to be before you do the others. Then I'll do the DC jack. Again, hold it in place. Make sure it's straight. This one has a lot of wiggle room, so just make sure it's straight. Again, once I get one solder, I can let it go and then heat it up again and move it to where I want it to be. And then I'll do the other two. But just one solder point, it's easy to move. If you do them all, it becomes a lot more work. Next, we're going to do the power supplies. So right here goes this one. This is the phantom power supply. So it takes the 9 volts coming in here and converts it to 48 volts. For this, you will need to cut this. Just take your cutters. There are little notches here. You know, 4 separate ones. we'll be using the rest of that, so don't throw it away. Set these down in here. Doesn't matter if you put the long side down or the short side down. Probably a little easier to put the long side down. And then put this on top of it. So we've got in plus, out plus, line those up. And put the board on. And then solder the top part. So if you soldered these first and then try to put it in the board, it wouldn't quite line up right, possibly. So let's make sure it lines up right. Those 4 pins. And then we're going to turn it over. So you have to hold it in place again like we've been doing. Solder that first pin so it's held in place. There we go. I think I got this one quite soldered, did I? And then got the other one, looks like this. And this one's going to take the +9 that comes in and convert it to plus and minus 15 volts. So it just sits right there. And I'm going to solder one of these pins from the top to hold it in place. And then flip it over. Solder the ones on the bottom. Cut those off. So I always hold my finger over it when I cut them so it doesn't fly off and hit somebody else in the face or myself in the face. Go ahead and cut these transistor pins that I didn't get before. Go. Next I'm going to do my trimmer potentiometer. This sets the Q bias of the FET that does the compression. It goes right here. So on the potentiometer itself, there's a side that has some little bumps sticking out on there. Also on the circuit board, the symbol shows that as well. So make sure those are lined up. These always get bent a little bit. Straighten out the pins. Hold it, flip it over. Go. And that's all the components on the top, at least, of this section. So we need to finish this small board and then put all the controls on the top. So I'm going to do the controls next, and I'll just do the small board by itself. So now we'll go to the other side of the board. and start doing the potentiometers. So we'll start with VR1, which is a 10K ref log. So this is your gain control. So all the potentiometers have labels on them. So this one says B1M, so that's a linear 1 megohm. We're looking for a C10K. There it is, that's C10K. That is the reverse log potentiometer. Now, when you put them in, go ahead and take the nut, which is this part, and the washer off, because we need to cut this little bit, extra bit off. A little bit of tab that's sticking up. I'm going to cut that off. And then if you want, you can put the nut and washer back on, or you can put them in your parts bag. So that's VR1, which is right over here. So we'll put that in. Push it down into place. It should push with a little bit of force. And I'm just going to leave it sitting on top. Make sure that it's really flat. This is really important because it won't quite go together if you don't get it all the way in. So the two holes on the sides, those go in pretty tight to hold it in place. So make sure it's down all the way. Check it really close. Make sure it's sitting flat. There are legs on both sides. Make sure those are flat against the board. And then that's something we can solder from the top. So I'll do the two outside pins from the top just to hold it in place for sure. And then the other 3 pins I will do from the bottom because I think it's a little bit easier. And then VR2 is 100K log, so that means a 100K. So there's that. Same thing, take the washer and the nut off. If you want to, you can just loosen them a bit, enough to get in with your cutters and cut that extra piece off. Again, put it in place. Making sure it goes down in tight. So the sides from the top. And then flip it over. Solder these. VR3, 10K log. So that's the A10K. I just had it in my hand. It's that one. I cut that off on top of my board just so it's under the camera. I would recommend not doing that because then you might have a piece of metal sitting on your board that could cause a problem later. And then VR4, which is 25K lens, so it's a B25K. That's VR4, which is right here. Its label that says VR4 got left off of the board, it got off of the way. So that's VR4, VR5 is labeled. So the only one that's not labeled is VR4. Sorry about that, I did not catch that when I did the board design. Again, this takes a little bit of force to push them in. Make sure you take that and push them in all the way, or it won't line up with the chassis. And you want to make sure it fits in the case. And then our last one, VR5, is 1 meg ohm linear, so B 1 meg. B 1 meg. And I forgot to cut that one, so I'll take it back out. You can cut it once they're soldered, but it's a lot easier to do now. Now I'll flip over and do all those other connections. That one. And then we have these switches. So they go in. There is a notch in the switch to line up. It's not a big deal if you don't get it lined up though. Again, these you need to be careful about. They're pretty loose, so make sure you hold them in place, solder one of the connections. Check and make sure it's straight. Before you solder the others. If it's not, reheat that and move it where you want it. When you reheat it, hold it in place and move it where you want it. Don't take it completely out, because then we'll have to clean out the soldering hole. Which is possible, but it's a lot easier if you don't have to do that. I'm lining up that notch with what's on the circuit board. If you don't do that though, it's not a huge deal. It won't make any difference to the use of it. Your switch will still do exactly what you want it to do. Again, check and make sure it's flat. Nice and good. That's where I want it. These switches have big pieces of metal for leads, so they'll take a little bit more time maybe to get a good solder. The more metal there is, the more it'll take away the heat. The more heat it needs. Just be aware of that. There you go. I'm going to go ahead and put this nut and washer back on the one that I took it off of. In case you're wondering about these holes here that we haven't done anything with, there are extra socket pins you can put in there. And if you do that, then you can use a discrete op amp instead of this IC op amp for an upgrade in your audio. So now we're going to break off this sideboard. So just take a hold of it and do that. If you're really worried about it, you could take your cutters and cut this part here before I break it off. That would make it break a little easier. I do want to go ahead and cut the excess off now. But you'll hear a breaking sound. It's supposed to do that. It is designed to break where it breaks. So it's okay to do that. And on this board, we need to put in the transformer and the XLR. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to add a little bit of solder to this big piece of metal here. I need a little bit more to this, have this raised up a bit so it makes better contact with the case of the transformer. So I'm just melting as much solder as I can on there. Go. And then I just want to put the transformer in. Let me zoom in a little bit. So on the board, there's a dot, a little circle there. There's also one on the transformer. So just line those up. That tells you how to put it in. And then sometimes you have to wiggle a little bit. And then set it down so the transformer is down on the table. And it's really important that you make good contact between the bottom of your transformer, this metal, and this metal, the solder that we added, because that gets you good shielding on this transformer. So I want to push down as I solder my first pin, and then while I still got the iron on, it's still hot, I'm pushing down really hard to make sure it makes good connection. What I'm going to do is go ahead and solder the others. And then my combo jack, which is both a 1/4 inch and an XLR. So it goes in here. And this has some special pins that hold in place. So you got to use a little bit of force to push it down in. There you go. Again, you want to make sure it's really flat against the bottom. I'm going to solder this pin in the middle first. Double check that it's still flat against. Yep, that's good. And then solder all the rest. There we go. And that means this little board is done. Last part to do is this circuit board for the LEDs on the meter. I would recommend leaving it on here, attached to the other board. It'll just be a little bit easier to do that. So, zoom back out for you. And then next thing we'll be working on is this part for these LEDs. Now we're on to our last components, these diodes. So the diodes have two different length leads. The long lead is the anode, which is the positive. The short lead is the cathode, which is the negative. On the board, the long lead, the anode, goes into the square pad, and then the short lead goes into the round pad. So start by putting these first 5 in. There's a little stop on them, so they only go a little bit. Sorry, I gotta focus. So when you put them in, there's little bumps of metal on them, right about there. And that's where they stop. That's where you want them to be. So we're going to put this 5 in and solder them, then this 4 and solder them, then the 3, then the 2, and then the 1. If you put them all in at once, you won't be able to solder them easily. Be really careful that you get all these in correctly, because they're really difficult to take out and replace if you get them in backwards. Again, the long lead goes to the square pad. And then when you solder them, you want to make sure that they are all sitting flat and all the way down against those bumps. Also make sure they're all straight. If you push too hard, you can sometimes push them through the board to be flat against the circuit board. We don't want that. So then I'm just going to turn them sideways a little bit to solder them. That way they don't fall out. Same process of soldering. So I'm going through and soldering all the cathodes first. And then I'll solder all the anodes. Couldn't quite get to them from where I was. Once you've soldered one of the sides, so I've got the cathodes soldered, I can now go through and solder all the anodes this way and they won't fall out. Then I'm going to trim these leads. Again, the cutters go down against one side, drop it until it stops. That's where I want to cut. That lets me cut everything I need taken off, but not into the actual solder itself. And then we just keep doing that. Go ahead and snap the LED circuit board off like you did the other one. And then we need to put in these risers. So again, we're going to use this. We need one that has 2 that we'll cut off, one that has 4. So cut both of those. And then they go on this side of the board with the white outline. So this you need to be really cautious that they are really straight and flat. So like we've done before, I'm going to solder one of the leads. Now I'm holding onto it from behind on some of the bottom leads while I solder the top lead, because the lead you solder will get hot. And there I let go too soon, and it came through. So it fell back out. So I gotta put it back in. Now there's some melted solder in that first hole, so I can't get it back in there. So I'm just hold it with my fingernail and heat that solder back up, and then it'll come through. It's not quite straight, so I'm gonna straighten it out. I'm gonna heat it up, straighten it out to where I want it, hold it in place. If you want to use a pair of pliers, you can. It does get a little bit hot. That looks good though. Yeah, that's good. So now I can solder the other three. Then the one with two. Same process. That looks pretty good to me. So I'll solder the other one. That first one was a little weird looking on this side, so after I've soldered the second one and it cooled, I went ahead and soldered the first one to make sure all the solders were good. If you end up leaving your nuts and washers on the switches and potentiometers, go ahead and take all of those off now. And then also take that LED board you built, and there are two spots for those two headers you put in. Go ahead and put those in there. Might have to wiggle it a little bit to get them in and push it down all the way. You've also got this longer set of header pins. There are 4. These are for the input transformer and jack. They go right here. So again, they go on the side with the white outline. Same process. Hold them in place. Solder one of them. Check that they're straight. It's not as important here because these bend pretty easy because they're so long, but it is still good to have them as straight as you can get them when you get that first solder in. There we go. Then I'll do the others. And take your LED board, goes here. So now on your circuit board, on the side with the potentiometers, there are 2 outlines for this board. Just place those in there. Might have to wiggle it a little bit to get them to fit, and push it all the way down. And then take your case, set it into the case, like that. And then once the connectors on this end get to their holes, push the whole board toward them, like that. And then you have to wiggle a little bit the 2 sets of pins for your LED board until those LEDs fit through the holes. And that takes a little bit of messing with it to get it to work. I'm just going to use my cutters to gently push those pins down a little bit. Looking at them and seeing how they line up, trying to get them to line up well. There we go. There we go. Once they fit in, then you've got that in place. Go ahead and put a nut and washer on this middle compression control. Just hold it in place for now. Just finger tighten it. It doesn't really have to be hugely tight. We just want it to not fall out. And then take your transformer board. So it goes in the XLR through the mounting hole, and then line up the header pins. And then that's what it looks like when you're done. So then you just need to put the rest of the 1/4" connector on. So this is a little washer, and there's the outside nut piece. Put those together. The angled part of the washer is on the outside. Just put that in. Finger tightening is usually okay, but if you want to use a pair of pliers lightly on it, that's okay. Don't make it horribly tight. And you got these little screws to go in the XLR. Put your lid on, and you've got these 4 screws to hold the lid on. And then there's some little rubber feet to go on here just so it has something to sit on. And add your knobs. The knobs have small screws in them. Put those on, tighten them down. Make sure they go minimum and maximum with the line where you want it. And you can decide this wherever you want. I put it opposite sides of the writing at the bottom, but however you want to do it is fine. There's an alignment process still to do before you can completely put the back on that we'll go through in a separate video.